September 14th, 2019, 6:12 p.m., Studio 8H, a cavernous soundstage tucked behind the main lot of a television network in Burbank, California. The kind of building that looked like a warehouse from the outside, but held dreams and heartbreaks on the inside. That evening, the studio audience of 400 people had no idea they were about to witness something that would never make it to the final broadcast, but would change 3 lives forever. The cameras were rolling, the lights were blinding, and a 17-year-old boy was about to walk onto the most terrifying stage of his life. But first, the judges. 4 chairs behind a long illuminated desk. In the far left chair sat Simon Cowell, 59 years old, arms crossed, jaw set, wearing his trademark black V-neck t-shirt stretched tight across his chest. Simon had been doing this for 18 years across 3 continents, and his face carried the permanent expression of a man who had heard 10,000 bad singers and was expecting the 10,001st. Next to him sat the other regular judges, professionals in their own right, but on this particular taping, there was a guest in the 4th chair, a last-minute addition that the producers had scrambled to arrange. The guest judge sat quietly, almost invisibly, in the far-right chair. He wore a mustard-coloured linen shirt, a black hat with a wide brim casting a shadow over his face, and a strand of wooden prayer beads around his neck. His dark eyes moved slowly across the studio, taking in the lights, the cameras, the nervous energy of the audience. He looked like he'd rather be somewhere else. A meditation room, perhaps, or a small stage in a club where the only audience was the music itself. But he was here because a friend had asked him, and Carlos Santana Barragan had never been good at saying no to friends. The producers had announced the guest judge's name to the audience an hour earlier, and the reaction had been exactly what you'd expect. Gasps, applause, a few tears from the older members of the crowd who had grown up with Abraxas playing on their parents' turntable. But now, 6 acts into the taping, the initial excitement had settled into routine. The audience had watched 3 singers, a magician, a dance crew, and a comedian. Simon had been predictably brutal with most of them. The guest judge had been quiet, offering gentle comments, nodding thoughtfully. The audience was beginning to wonder if the legendary guitarist was going to do anything memorable at all. Then the stage manager's voice crackled through the backstage monitors. Next act, Jake Morrison, 17, guitarist, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Behind the curtain, Jake Morrison stood alone, his fingers wrapped around the neck of a Fender Stratocaster that was older than he was. The guitar had belonged to his grandfather, Richard Morrison, who had played in a blues band in Des Moines in the 1960s before a factory accident took 3 fingers from his left hand and ended his musical career at 26. Richard had kept the guitar in a case under his bed for 40 years, never playing it again but never selling it either. When Jake was 9, Richard had opened the case in front of his grandson for the first time, and Jake had seen the sunburst finish catch the bedroom light like a piece of trapped fire. "This guitar has been waiting for someone," Richard had said. "I think it's been waiting for you." Jake had taught himself to play on that Stratocaster. No lessons, no teacher, no YouTube tutorials, just the guitar, a second-hand amplifier from a pawn shop in Waterloo, and 8 years of playing in his bedroom until his fingers bled and calluses formed like armor. His mother, Linda, worked double shifts at the Cedar Falls Regional Medical Center. His father had left when Jake was 4. There was no money for music lessons, no money for a better guitar, no money for anything that wasn't food or rent or keeping the lights on. But Jake had the Stratocaster, and the Stratocaster had Jake, and together they had built something extraordinary in that small bedroom on Tremont Street. Jake had applied to the talent show on a dare from his best friend Marcus, who had filmed Jake playing in the school parking lot and uploaded the video without asking. The video got 11,000 views in a week. Marcus showed Jake the comments. "Dude, people are saying you sound like Santana." Jake had laughed. He didn't sound anything like Santana. Nobody sounded like Santana. But the video caught the attention of a casting producer who sent Jake an email, and 6 weeks later, here he was, standing behind a curtain in Burbank, California, 2,000 miles from home, wearing the only dress shirt he owned, his grandfather's guitar strapped across his chest, about to play for Simon Cowell. His hands were shaking, not trembling, shaking, the kind of full-body vibration that starts in your stomach and radiates outward until even your teeth feel loose. He closed his eyes and heard his grandfather's voice. "The guitar doesn't care if you're scared, Jake. It only cares if you're honest." The curtain parted. Jake stepped into the light. 400 pairs of eyes locked onto him simultaneously, and the weight of their collective attention pressed against his chest like a physical force. The stage was bigger than his entire apartment. The lights were so bright that the audience beyond the first 3 rows dissolved into a dark, breathing mass. He could see the judge's desk illuminated like an altar, and behind it, 4 faces waiting to decide his fate. He walked to the center mark on the stage, a small X made of gaffer tape that a stagehand had pointed out to him 5 minutes ago. His sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. The sound echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. He adjusted the guitar strap on his shoulder and tried to remember how to breathe. Simon Cowell leaned forward, his eyes scanning Jake the way a butcher scans a cut of meat. The V-neck t-shirt, the crossed arms, the slightly raised left eyebrow. It was a look that had destroyed grown men, reduced professional singers to tears, ended careers before they started. Simon saw a skinny teenager in an ill-fitting dress shirt, holding a guitar that looked like it had been through a war. The finish was chipped in a dozen places, the pickguard was scratched, and one of the tuning pegs had been replaced with a mismatched chrome one that stuck out like a bad tooth. Human beings the way a factory processes raw material. Jake Morrison. His voice cracked on the second syllable of Morrison. Someone in the audience let out a small, sympathetic laugh. Age? 17. Where are you from, Jake? Cedar Falls, Iowa, sir. Simon's eyebrow climbed half an inch higher. Cedar Falls, and what do you do in Cedar Falls? I go to school. Cedar Falls High. I'm a junior. And you play guitar, obviously. Simon gestured at the Stratocaster with a slight wave of his hand, the gesture carrying a barely concealed dismissal, as if the guitar was a toy brought to a business meeting. Yes, sir. How long have you been playing? 8 years, since I was 9. Lessons? No, sir. Self-taught. Simon exchanged a glance with the judge next to him. It was a glance that Jake couldn't read from the stage, but the audience caught it. It said, "Here we go. Another self-taught kid who thinks he's the next big thing." The audience shifted uncomfortably. They'd seen Simon dismantle self-taught performers before. It was never pretty. But in the far-right chair, Carlos Santana had straightened up slightly. The words self-taught had landed differently in his ears. He looked at Jake's hands, the way the boy's left fingers were positioned on the fretboard, even though he wasn't playing yet. The natural curl of the fingertips, the thumb placement behind the neck. It was correct. Not textbook correct, but musically correct. The kind of hand position that came from thousands of hours of playing, not from a YouTube tutorial watched twice. Carlos said nothing. He just watched. "And what are you going to play for us today, Jake?" Simon asked, already leaning back in his chair, already half checked out. In Simon's mental filing cabinet, this boy was already categorized. Small-town kid, no training, beat-up guitar, nervous wreck. He'd play something sloppy, Simon would deliver a firm but fair rejection, and they'd move on to the next act. It was 6:20 p.m. Simon wanted to be done by 8. He had dinner reservations at Nobu. Jake swallowed hard. "I'm going to play an instrumental piece. It's called Europa by Santana." Something shifted in the room. It was subtle, like a change in air pressure before a storm. The audience murmured. A few people glanced at the guest judge in the far-right chair. Carlos Santana's expression didn't change, but his hands, which had been resting on the desk, slowly moved to his lap. He folded them together, the prayer beads wrapped around his right wrist, and waited. Simon, however, missed the significance entirely. He didn't listen to Santana. Simon Cowell's musical universe revolved around pop vocals, boy bands, and commercial hits. Instrumental guitar wasn't just outside his expertise, it was outside his interest. To Simon, a 17-year-old playing a guitar instrumental on a talent show was like someone bringing a typewriter to a smartphone convention. Technically impressive, maybe, but commercially irrelevant. An instrumental, Simon repeated, his tone carrying the faintest trace of a smirk. No singing? No, sir, just guitar. Simon nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when a patient describes symptoms of a disease that has no cure. All right then, whenever you're ready. Jake closed his eyes. He thought of his grandfather's hands, the two remaining fingers on the left hand that could no longer form a chord. He thought of his mother working the night shift, her shoes worn through at the soles. He thought of his bedroom on Tremont Street, the only place in the world where he felt like he belonged. Then he played. The first note of Europa rose from the Stratocaster like smoke from a candle, thin, fragile, almost invisible. But it carried something inside it, a weight that had no physical form. It was the sound of a boy who had spent 8 years alone in a bedroom, talking to a guitar because there was no one else to talk to. The note hung in the air for a moment, trembling, and then Jake's fingers began to move. What happened next would be debated in the studio for weeks. The cameramen, who had seen everything, who had filmed opera singers and acrobats and magicians pulling rabbits from hats, would later say that in 11 years of this television show, they had never once forgotten they were holding cameras. Until now. The lead cameraman, a veteran named Doug Parsons, who had worked the show since season 1, would tell his wife that night, "I almost dropped the camera. My hands just went limp. I forgot where I was." Jake played Europa the way it was meant to be played. Not as a technical exercise, not as a cover, not as a performance. He played it as a conversation with someone who wasn't in the room. Every note was a question, and every answer came from the silence between the notes. His fingers moved across the fretboard with the fluency of water running downhill, natural, inevitable, as if any other path was impossible. The vibrato was deep and slow, the kind that comes from the wrist, not the fingers, the kind that takes years to develop and cannot be faked. Each bend was precise, hitting the target note and then releasing it gently, the way you release a bird you've been holding in your hands. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't move. 400 people sat in their seats and felt something they hadn't felt since they were children, that moment when the world stops spinning and you realize you're in the presence of something sacred. A woman in the third row had her eyes closed, tears running down both cheeks, her husband's hand gripping hers so tightly that his knuckles were white. A teenage boy in the back row, who had come with his mother and had been bored all evening, was leaning forward with his mouth slightly open, his phone forgotten in his lap. A stagehand standing in the wings, a tattooed man in his 40s who had worked 100 tapings, had set down his clipboard and was just standing there, arms at his sides, listening. Simon Cowell was not listening the way the others were. Simon was processing. His brain, wired for commercial potential, was running calculations. The kid could play, he'd give him that. But an instrumental guitarist on a talent show? No vocals, no stage presence in the traditional sense, no marketable image. The boy was skinny, awkward, wearing a shirt that didn't fit. Simon had signed enough artists to know that talent alone wasn't enough. You needed the package, and this kid didn't have the package. Simon had already composed his feedback in his head. "Look, Jake, you're clearly talented, but this isn't the right platform for what you do. Instrumental guitar is a niche. It's not commercial. I'd suggest you go home, find a band, learn to sing, come back in a few years with something we can work with." But Carlos Santana was not processing. Carlos Santana was somewhere else entirely. When Jake had played the first 3 notes of Europa, something had happened inside Carlos that he hadn't expected. His hands had gone cold, his chest had tightened, and behind his closed eyes he was no longer sitting in a television studio in Burbank. He was standing on a stage at Woodstock, August 16th, 1969, 22 years old, the neck of his guitar turning into a snake because Jerry Garcia had given him mescaline 30 minutes before the set. He was fighting the hallucination, trying to hold on to reality, and the only thing that kept him grounded was the music. The notes coming from his fingers were the rope that kept him from falling into an abyss. And now, 50 years later, a 17-year-old boy from Iowa was pulling that same rope, playing those same notes with the same desperate sincerity, and Carlos felt the ground shift beneath him the same way it had shifted at Woodstock. This boy wasn't just playing Europa, he was living inside it. He had found the door that Carlos had hidden inside the melody 50 years ago, the door that led to the place where music stops being sound and becomes something else, something that has no name in any language. And this boy, this skinny, nervous, self-taught kid from Cedar Falls, had walked through that door without even knowing it existed. Jake played the final note. It faded slowly, like the last light of sunset dissolving into the horizon. He opened his eyes. The studio was silent. Not the awkward silence of a bad performance, but the heavy, reverent silence that follows something holy. 400 people staring, not moving, barely breathing. Then Simon Cowell spoke. "Jake." Simon's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. He leaned forward, both elbows on the desk, his fingers interlocked. His face carried that expression the audience knew too well, the one that came before the kill. "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve applause." Jake's stomach dropped. He could feel it physically, a sensation like missing a step on a staircase. His fingers tightened around the neck of his grandfather's guitar. "You can play," Simon continued. "I'm not going to pretend you can't. You clearly have some ability. But here's the reality, and I say this not to be cruel, but because someone needs to tell you." He paused, letting the silence build the way a prosecutor pauses before delivering a verdict. "You're 17 years old, standing on a stage with no band, no vocals, no image, playing an instrumental piece that maybe 2% of the general audience would even recognize. This is a talent competition, Jake, not a guitar recital. The people who win these shows, the people who go on to have careers, they connect with an audience, they have presence, they have something you can sell. What you did just now was technically impressive, I'll give you that, but it's not enough. Technique without commercial viability is just a hobby." The audience stirred. A few people booed softly. Simon ignored them. He always ignored them. "I've been in this industry for 35 years, Simon continued, his voice steady, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "And I've seen hundreds of guitarists come through shows like this. You know where most of them end up? Playing in bars for $50 a night, teaching guitar lessons to kids who quit after 3 months, uploading YouTube videos that get 200 views. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I've seen it happen again and again. Instrumental guitar is not a viable career path. It's a nice skill to have at parties. But as a career, on a stage this big?" He shook his head slowly. "You'll never make it as a guitarist. Not on this stage. Not on any stage that matters." The words landed on Jake like stones dropped from a great height. Each one hit a different part of him. "Not enough," hit his chest. "Just a hobby," hit his stomach. "You'll never make it as a guitarist," hit him somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't have a name, the place where a 9-year-old boy had first touched his grandfather's Stratocaster and believed, truly believed, that music could save his life. Jake's eyes were burning, but he wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of 400 strangers and a man in a V-neck t-shirt who had just told him his dream was a hobby. He bit the inside of his cheek so hard he tasted copper. His right hand gripped the guitar body, knuckles white, holding onto the instrument the way a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood. The audience was murmuring now, some sympathetic, some angry, some just uncomfortable. A woman in the 5th row whispered to her husband, "That was too harsh. He's just a kid." The husband shook his head. "That's Simon. That's what he does." The other 2 regular judges offered their comments. One was diplomatic. "Jake, you're very talented, but I agree that you need to think about the commercial side." The other was kinder. "I think you have something special, but maybe this isn't the right venue for it." Both were variations of the same message. Go home. You're not what we're looking for." 3 judges had spoken, 3 variations of no. Jake stood on the stage, his face pale under the harsh lights, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, and waited for the 4th judge to speak. He looked at the man in the far-right chair, the guest judge who had been quiet all evening, the man in the black hat and prayer beads who Jake hadn't recognized when he'd first walked on stage. Carlos Santana hadn't moved during Simon's speech. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on Jake. But if anyone had been watching Carlos closely, and the camera operator on the far right had been, they would have seen something remarkable. During Simon's words, "You'll never make it as a guitarist," Carlos Santana's jaw had tightened, not dramatically, not visibly to the naked eye from the audience, but on camera, in close-up, it was unmistakable. The muscles along his jawline had contracted, the way a man's jaw tightens when he's stopping himself from saying something he might regret. His right hand, hidden under the desk, had gripped his prayer beads so hard that one of the wooden beads had cracked. Now the studio was waiting. 400 people, 4 cameras, 17-year-old Jake Morrison and Simon Cowell, all waiting for the quiet man in the black hat to deliver his verdict. Carlos Santana unfolded his hands. He placed them flat on the desk, and then he did something no guest judge had ever done in the history of the show. He stood up. Simon folded his arms across his chest. His eyes were still locked on Miguel, but they weren't angry anymore. They were confused, because Simon Cowell had seen thousands of contestants in his career, thousands. But what was happening right now was something entirely new. An old man, uninvited, unannounced, was standing in front of the stage, defending a teenager, and he was doing it in a tone that commanded, not requested. Carlos looked at Miguel. The boy's eyes were wet, but he hadn't put the guitar down. He was still holding it against his chest, the way a child holds their most precious toy when someone tries to take it away. A faint smile crossed Carlos's face, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of recognition. He had seen himself in that boy. "You know something," Carlos said. His voice was soft now, but it echoed through the entire hall because everyone was silent. 1966. I was younger than this boy, 14 years old, Tijuana, Mexico. I used to play guitar on the streets, outside restaurants, outside bars, where then, for coins, people walked past me like I was invisible. He took a breath. One night, a man stopped. He listened for maybe 30 seconds. Then he threw a coin at my feet, not in my hand, at my feet, and said, "Kid, get a real job. Music won't feed you." Nobody in the hall moved, 4,000 people, and not a single breath could be heard. Camera 3 slowly zoomed in on Carlos's face, and in his eyes, that night from 1966 was still alive, still burning, still fresh, as if it had happened yesterday. 3 years later, August 16th, 1969, I stood on the stage at Woodstock, 400,000 people in front of me. I played Soul Sacrifice, and the world changed for me that night. I was 22 years old, 22. He raised his fingers, the same fingers that had played that legendary solo at Woodstock, and pointed at Miguel's guitar. That coin, the one that man threw at my feet, I still have it, in a glass case, in my house, not because it's worth anything, but because it reminds me every single day that the people who tell you you can't, they are never the people who decide your future. Simon Cowell's face had changed. That angry expression was gone, replaced by something that rarely appeared on Simon's face, uncertainty. He looked down at the notes in front of him, then back at Carlos, then at Miguel, then back at Carlos again. Carlos took one step forward, closer to the judge's table. "May I?" he asked Miguel, extending his hand toward the guitar. Miguel hesitated for a moment. This was his father's guitar, the only thing his father had left behind, but then he slowly handed it over. Carlos took the guitar, and the moment his fingers touched the strings, his entire body changed. His shoulders straightened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes closed. And then, that sound. Carlos Santana placed his fingers on the strings and played a soft melody, very slowly, the first 4 notes of Europa, the same notes that were recorded on the Amigos album in 1976, the same notes that had made millions of people cry across the world, the same notes that had been covered by guitarists in every country on every continent. Some people in the hall recognized it immediately. A woman in the 3rd row covered her mouth with her hand. A man in the 5th row stood up. Whispers started spreading from the back rows. "Oh my God, is that's Europa! That's Carlos Santana!" But Simon still hadn't understood. He looked at Amanda. Amanda's face had gone white. Her lips were trembling. Simon leaned over and whispered, "Do you know who this is?" Amanda nodded yes, but couldn't speak. Carlos stopped playing. The last note was still ringing through the hall, hanging in the air like smoke after a candle is blown out, and he looked at Miguel. "This guitar," Carlos said, handing it back to Miguel, "is not just wood and strings. This guitar has a soul. I can feel it. Someone loved this guitar. Someone played it with their whole heart, and that love is still inside these strings." Tears were rolling down Miguel's cheeks, but he was smiling. "My father," Miguel said. His voice was shaking. "It was my father's guitar. He died 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. He taught me everything on this guitar." Carlos closed his eyes, just for a moment, and then said softly, "Then your father is still here, right here, in every note you play." The silence in the hall was not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before a great storm, when the wind stops, when the birds go quiet, and when the clouds in the sky are about to collide with each other. 4,000 people were sitting in their seats, but nobody was breathing, because everyone knew, from the 3rd row to the very last row, everyone had figured it out, but Simon Cowell still had no idea. Amanda Holden placed her hand on Simon's arm, gently, the way you wake someone who is sleeping. "Simon," Amanda said, and there was a tremor in her voice. "That man, standing right there, that's Carlos Santana." Simon's face, the face that had not changed expression through thousands of auditions, the face that didn't blink while saying, "You're terrible," that face changed now. First confusion, then doubt, then realization, and then fear. Pure, undiluted fear. Camera 1 took a close-up. Simon's eyes had widened, his mouth was slightly open, and his hands, those hands that were always confident, were trembling under the table. That's not," Simon stammered. 10 Grammy Awards," Amanda said, and now there was an edge in her voice. "Over 100 million records sold worldwide, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the man who played Soul Sacrifice at Woodstock when he was 22 years old. Yes, Simon, that is Carlos Santana. And you just told a teenager in front of him that he'll never be a guitarist." Simon wanted to lean back in his chair, but the chair couldn't go any further. He cleared his throat, but no sound came out. For 20 years this man had judged others. For 20 years he had told people they weren't good enough. And today, for the first time, he was the one being judged. And the person judging him wasn't just anyone. It was a living legend of the music world. Someone in the audience started clapping, then one more, then 5, then 50, and then the entire hall erupted in applause. But these claps were not for Simon. These claps were for Miguel, and for Carlos, and for every single human being who had ever been told, "You can't do this." Carlos raised his hand, and the applause slowly died down. "Mr. Cowell," Carlos said. And now there was no anger in his voice and no sarcasm, just a calmness that comes from decades of experience. "I didn't come here to embarrass you. I came here because I was walking past this building and I heard a guitar, and something in that sound made me stop." He looked at Miguel. "When I was 14 in Tijuana, I played for coins on the street. My father, Jose Santana, he was a mariachi musician. He played the violin. He taught me that music is not about being perfect. Music is about being honest. And when I heard this boy play, I heard honesty, raw, unpolished, beautiful honesty." Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a small guitar pick, old, worn down, its color had faded, but Carlos held it as if it were a diamond. "This pick," Carlos said, "my father gave it to me in 1962. I was 15 years old. He said, 'Carlitos, One day this pick will play for the world. I've carried it for 63 years. 63 years. He placed the pick in front of Miguel, not on the table, in Miguel's hand. I want you to have this. Miguel looked at the pick. His fingers were trembling. It was a simple guitar pick, maybe worth a few cents in any store. But this pick had seen Woodstock. This pick had played Smooth. This pick had played Europa. This pick had made history in the hands that won 10 Grammy Awards. This pick had traveled to 120 countries. And now it was sitting in the palm of a 17-year-old boy from Brooklyn who 10 minutes ago was told he would never be a guitarist. I can't take this, Miguel said. Tears were running down his cheeks. You're not taking it, Carlos said, and smiling. I'm passing it forward. Someone believed in me when no one else did. My father, Jose Santana, a mariachi violinist from Outland de Navarro, a man the world never knew, but a man who gave the world Carlos Santana. He believed in me, and now I'm believing in you. Simon Cowell, who had been silent this entire time, whose face was painted with shame, slowly stood up. The entire hall was watching him. Camera 2 took his full shot. Simon Cowell, the man who never apologizes, the man who is always right, the man in front of whom people tremble. Today he himself was trembling. Simon started, stopped, started again. I owe you an apology, young man. Simon Cowell was standing, and the entire hall was watching him. This was not the Simon that people had seen on television for 20 years. This Simon was different. His shoulders were slouched, his eyes were lowered, and his voice, that voice that made contestants' legs tremble, today, that voice itself was trembling. Miguel, Simon said, and he used the boy's name for the first time. In the entire audition, he hadn't called him kid or young man. He called him by his name. I was wrong. I looked at you, and I saw what was on the outside, a nervous teenager with an old guitar, and I decided in 3 seconds that you weren't good enough. 3 seconds. That's all I gave you. He shook his head, slowly, as if he was talking to himself. I've been doing this for 20 years, sitting in this chair, judging people. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what music is actually about. It's not about perfection. It's not about hitting every note. It's about, he looked at Carlos, it's about honesty. You were right. Carlos nodded, but said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was the loudest answer in the room. Simon stepped out from behind the judges' panel and walked toward the stage. This was the first time during today's audition that he had left his seat and come all the way to the stage. He stopped in front of Miguel, just 2 steps away from the boy, and he extended his hand. Shake my hand, Simon said, and accept my apology, not as a judge, but as a man who made a mistake. Miguel took Simon's hand. His hand was still shaking, but there was a strength in that trembling grip that wasn't there 10 minutes ago. Carlos Santana had given him that strength, through a guitar pick, through a story, through belief. The audience had lost their minds, clapping and screaming, whistling, and people were standing up, a full standing ovation, but the biggest moment was still yet to come. Carlos walked back toward the stage, stood right next to Miguel, shoulder to shoulder, and looked out at the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Carlos said. His voice was loud now, confident, the same voice that echoed through stadiums across the world. This young man, Miguel, is going to play for you right now, not for the judges, not for the cameras, not for the votes. He's going to play for his father. And he smiled and looked at Miguel, I'm going to play with him. The hall went completely silent for one single heartbeat, and then an explosion. Applause so loud that the walls shook. People were standing on their seats screaming. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Some had their hands on their heads in complete disbelief. Backstage crew members were peeking through the side doors. The production manager pulled off his headset and just stared at the stage, because this was something nobody had planned. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't in the rehearsal notes. This was completely and purely real. A production assistant came running from backstage, carrying a guitar case. He opened it right there on the side of the stage, and inside was a PRS Santana 2 Tiger Eye finish, gleaming under the stage lights like a jewel. It was Carlos's own guitar, the one that had been sitting in his car, because Carlos Santana never traveled anywhere without a guitar, not in 58 years, not once. This was the same model that Paul Reed Smith had designed specifically for Carlos back in 1999, the same guitar that had played on stages in 120 countries, the same guitar that had earned 10 Grammy Awards. And now, that guitar was here, in a small audition hall in London, about to play alongside a 17-year-old boy's scratched-up Fender acoustic that was held together by memory and love. Carlos took the PRS out of its case, held it for a moment, ran his thumb across the strings without pressing them, just feeling them, the way a painter touches his brush before the first stroke, and then he plugged it into the amp on stage, turned the volume down to 3, just enough to whisper, and looked at Miguel. "What did your father teach you first?" Carlos asked. His voice was gentle, like a grandfather asking his grandchild about their favorite story. Miguel's eyes filled up again, but this time he didn't wipe them. He let the tears stay, and he said, "He taught me Redemption Song, Bob Marley. It was the first song I ever learned. I was 9 years old. He sat behind me on the bed, put his arms around me, placed my fingers on the chords and said, 'Feel it before you play it.'" Carlos smiled, Ben, a real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the lip, and said, "Then that's what we play." Miguel placed his fingers on the strings, his father's guitar, his father's song, his father's memory, and he began to strum. The first chord rang out, G major, open, warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a week of rain. The sound filled the hall the way water fills a glass, slowly, completely, until there was no room left for anything else. And then Carlos joined in. The first note from Carlos's PRS guitar floated through the hall like a prayer, soft, gentle, barely there, like a whisper from someone you thought you'd never hear again. Carlos wasn't leading, he was following, letting Miguel's rhythm set the pace, letting the boy's scratched-up Fender acoustic be the voice, while his PRS was just the echo, the shadow, the gentle hand on the shoulder that says, "I'm right here, keep going." Miguel began to sing, his voice cracked on the first line. "Old pirates, yes, they rob I." And someone in the audience let out a sob, not a quiet one, a loud, broken sob, because everyone in that hall understood what was happening. This boy wasn't performing. This boy was talking to his dead father, through the only language they had ever shared. Music. Carlos didn't sing. He didn't need to. His guitar was singing for him. Every note he played was a sentence, every bend was a paragraph. Every pause was a breath between two people who understood each other without words. The PRS and the old Fender acoustic were having a conversation. One was expensive and world-famous. The other was scratched and held together by memory. But together, they sounded like they had been playing together for 100 years. By the second verse, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery," Miguel's voice had steadied. The cracks were gone. The trembling was gone. He was standing straight, shoulders back, chin up, eyes closed, and there was a look on his face that no camera could fully capture. Peace. Pure, absolute, unshakable peace. As if his father was standing right behind him, hand on his shoulder, saying, "That's my boy." Simon Cowell was sitting with his hand over his mouth. His eyes were red. He didn't blink, not once, for the entire 3 minutes and 42 seconds of the performance. Amanda was crying openly, tears running down both cheeks, her mascara completely ruined, and she didn't care. The third judge, David, had taken off his glasses and was wiping them with his tie, but his glasses weren't dirty. His eyes were. When the last chord faded, when the last note from Carlos's PRS dissolved into the silence like sugar dissolving into warm water, nobody moved. For 4 full seconds, 4 seconds that felt like 4 hours, the hall was completely still. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a single phone screen glowing in the dark. And then it began. Not applause, not cheering, something deeper, something older, something that came from a place inside people that has no name. 4,000 people rose to their feet, simultaneously, as if pulled by a single invisible string, and the sound that came out of them was not a clap. It was a roar, a wave, a wall of sound that hit the stage like an ocean crashing against a cliff. Carlos put his guitar down, gently, the way you put down a sleeping child, and turned to Miguel. He placed both hands on the boy's shoulders, looked him directly in the eyes, and said 5 words that Miguel would remember for the rest of his life. "Your father would be proud." Miguel broke. He didn't cry. He shattered. He dropped his head onto Carlos's shoulder, and for 15 seconds, in front of 4,000 strangers and 17 cameras, a 17-year-old boy who had lost his father cried on the shoulder of a man who understood exactly what music means when words aren't enough. Simon stood up, walked to his microphone, and with a voice that barely held together, said, "I have been in this industry for over 20 years. I have sat in this chair and judged thousands of people, and today, for the first time, I was the one who needed to be judged. Miguel, you don't need my yes. You never did, but you have it. You have all 3. 3 golden confetti cannons exploded from the ceiling. Gold and silver paper rained down on the stage. The audience was screaming and Miguel was laughing through his tears. Carlos was clapping with both hands above his head. Amanda was on her feet with mascara lines down her face. And somewhere, in that beautiful chaos of light and sound and paper and tears, somewhere in a dimension that cameras cannot reach and microphones cannot record, a father was watching his son and smiling. 6 months later, Miguel Rivera, 17 years old, from Brooklyn, New York, performed on the final stage of the biggest talent show in the world. He played his father's guitar, he wore his father's watch, and in his pocket, wrapped carefully in a small piece of cloth, was a 63-year-old guitar pick that once belonged to a man named Jose Santana, passed down through Carlos, and now carried by a boy who proved on the biggest stage of his life that the people who tell you you can't are never, ever the people who decide your future.